Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. Today I have with me Dr. Isabel Skinner, who's an assistant professor of politics at the University of Illinois Springfield. Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Skinner.
Thanks so much for having me, Connor.
So, the reason I brought you on today was to discuss something that is unfortunately an ongoing problem, not just in this election, but in many elections before and quite possibly long after, and that is sexism in towards women candidates in elections. I know we've talked about this quite a bit when we were covering my comprehensive exam for my master's program. So, spoiler alert, she has spoken with me before about this topic to some degree. But in the case of Vice President Kamala Harris, I wanted to ask you, to what extent does sexist stereotyping overlap with anti-Black prejudice and racism? And how does that impact the way in which voters perceive candidates like Kamala Harris?
Yes, this is a great question right off the bat. And definitely something I want to point out is that I'm currently an op-ed voices of public voices fellow for the op-ed project. And my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Tolliver over at UIUC, studies anti-Blackness. And she had this really great op-ed recently in Ms. Magazine. And she talked about this issue specifically, especially how candidates like Kamala Harris are forced to sort of defend their Blackness and therefore also their humanity. And there's attacks on her identity are trying to strip that from her. Also, you'll notice that Kamala Harris is really intentional about how she talks, or most importantly, maybe doesn't talk about her identity as a woman of color. And so that's really different. That's such a departure from the way Hillary Clinton really centered her gender during the campaign in 2016. So that's it's kind of obvious, but those are the things that have been circling around in my mind. But also, certainly, anti-Blackness is a huge problem, and it's sort of distinct from, like, I guess, broader run-of-the-mill racism, you could say. Anti-Blackness is a huge problem around the world, and it's definitely tied with sexism. Misogynoir is a term that describes this overlap kind of perfectly. But one thing I would note is that both sexism and racism played a role in Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016, according to research from colleagues in political science like Schaffer, McWilliams, Netta in 2018. That's a political science quarterly piece, or Nucky in 2019. That's a social science quarterly piece. So there's evidence that even though Hillary Clinton is a white woman, race still mattered in her race as well, her campaign as well, because again, she represented sort of this continuation of an Obama presidency, at least symbolically. So that's a little bit different than your question, but I hope that gets to some of these ideas.
Well, now that you mentioned like this influence of race, even influencing the perception of white women,
Hmm.
I'm reminded of this book when I was reading when I was getting my bachelor's in political science, Post Racial or Most Racial, which was talking about this
Mm,
idea of how sometimes white candidates can sometimes be seen as race traitors by virtue of their association with Black candidates. But in the case of
mm,
Kamala Harris, it seems like, or Kamala Harris, I sometimes mispronounce it. I'm not intentionally, unlike some of the people on the right as of late. One
right.
of the things that keeps coming up is there is this attempt to invalidate her identity as inauthentic. And I do think one of the
Yes.
things that keeps coming up, not just with Vice President Harris, but also with women candidates in general, is there seems to be this authenticity gap that is applied towards women that is not applied to men, especially as it relates to how brazen their rhetoric is, like for men, versus how women are allowed to speak as candidates. And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, just in general, women can't win in terms of stereotypes. I mean, think about, this is kind of true in the workplace, in politics, in personal life. If you're too masculine, that's a bad thing. If you're too feminine, that's a bad thing. If you're too loud, that's a bad thing. If you're too quiet, it's a bad. So it's kind of, there's definitely this way in which the stereotypes about women can really just put you in such a box. And this is also really true for Black women, especially, who have to walk this tightrope between being seen as effective communicators, but avoiding the angry Black woman stereotype. And of course, former President Trump did try to invalidate Kamala Harris's Blackness by arguing that she only recently became Black. And so you might say, but she's always identified as biracial, Black, and Indian. She was an AKA at Howard University, like she is Black. But again, as Tolliver points out, the problem is having to justify the identity, and then it also leads into stereotypes too about like what counts. How do you be Black correctly? How do you be Indian correctly? How to be a woman correctly? Ooh, it's just so tough to do. And so during a campaign, people are really put on the spotlight. I remember vividly that Hillary Clinton sort of famous or maybe infamously said, they expect me to be in the kitchen like baking cookies, and that's just not me. And so for her, she was trying to distance herself from the stereotype of like what women do. Like I love baking. There's all different kinds of ways to be a woman, right? But for her, she was really frustrated, I think, with the way that she was pigeonholed. And clearly, there was decades long sort of uh, formation of who Hillary Clinton was in the public eye. But Kamala Harris is a little bit more unknown, even though she's the first woman to fulfill this role as vice president.
Describing the difficulty of running not just as like a woman candidate is like, it reminds me of like how I kind of started hearing people talk about her when I first met Kamala Harris, when she was running for the Iowa caucus. I actually had a conversation with her about what we can do to help people with like mental health issues and to prevent
Mm,
suicide as it relates to gun violence. And she gave me a
wow.
very detailed answer about, access to emergency care, red flag laws and things like that. And back then that was in 2019. And yet I noticed that she went into a lot more detail than say other candidates,
Yeah.
male candidates that I had spoken to. And that goes to your point, like to some extent it seems like when Kamala Harris has to speak, she has to prove that she belongs in the room, even though she's been in the room much longer than former President Trump. But to circle back to that point about, the women belonging in the kitchen as the stereotype,
Hmm.
I know we've mentioned this in my closure exercise, but to what extent does our push for women to like at a young age to engage in quote unquote domestic work
Yeah.
influence the way in which we look at women later who get involved in politics?
Yeah, definitely. So, and also just like preach. That was some really good points there. I completely couldn't agree more. One of the things that in political science that we consider theories of, this gap. Why aren't more women involved in politics? So there's sort of oh there. Okay, there's my cat. There's my cat, kind of a little ghost back there.
That's
But
all right.
there's some different theories. So there's the demand and supply theories. So in the supply theory, we could say that women aren't socialized to, or girls aren't socialized to think about politics, to consider themselves as leaders. And this is certainly a problem. However, we're actually seeing that a lot of scholars have sort of shifted more towards thinking about like the other real barriers that exist in terms of like campaigning, and getting that money from the party is especially really important. That's why organizations like Emily's List are really important for gaining some traction for women candidates. But then also on the demand side, there's this idea of sexism and of how it's possible that women candidates are not preferred. However, some really interesting scholarship also looks at how head to head, men and women actually have the same amount of kind of preference from the general public as candidates. But then when you think about other factors like are they parents or not, people prefer parents for candidates, which is really interesting, especially because that might be a burden for women to be parents and candidates. Not that that's not perfectly possible, of course, that it is, but some of these feeder professions like law And for example, these high powered professions, there are more women that choose not to have kids in those professions, and so it's possible that that might not be the case. And so I think that it's really fascinating that this is called a double bind. So it's
Yep.
not a double standard. People don't want two different things. They want the same thing, but it's harder for one person than it is for the other person, right? So that's some really fascinating work out there as well. But I digress though. That's really some of the research out there about this issue.
It seems like your cat's trying to send a message to JD Vance there, I think.
Yes.
But
Yes.
no, like, but to your point, like, to some extent, I do think when we talk about this double bind issue, I think it's not so much that we have a society that, like, doesn't isn't so much interested in women candidates, isn't willing to consider women's labor as
Hmm.
equivalent to men's. And even the question of what is considered domestic labor has its own sexist undertones in that it could potentially view like even women who work in the home or deal with the consequences of political activity and engage on the local level are not
Yep.
somehow political. But
Right.
to use an example of some recent media coverage, I just have this here. One of the things that keeps coming up is that a lot of times women have to deal with conversations in the media that men simply do not. For
Yes.
example, this is a Daily Beast article that was out, I think, 2 days ago. It was, quote, Kamala Harris is well suited for president, but poorly dressed, unquote. And that article, surprisingly, was not written by a man. It was written by a woman.
Mm.
And so to some extent, I wonder, like, how do the ways in which people who engage with these issues sometimes reinforce and internalize
Yeah.
bad ideas that sometimes harm their own communities, and to what extent can we counter that?
Yeah, I mean, women bash women all the time, first of all. But then also, I remember seeing photos, we'll say, of the Women's March in which, people were holding up signs that said white women voted for Trump. And that's just a fact, that at the time in 2016, there was a lot of support among certain demographics of women for former President Trump. And so I think that it is important to recognize these cleavages among women. Women don't all think exactly the same, but certainly internalized sexism is an issue. We could think about, yeah, of course, there's JD Vance's attacks about Kamala Harris as a childless cat lady, but then we could also think about how Sarah Huckabee Sanders accused Kamala Harris of not being humble because she doesn't have children, yet she does have children because she's a stepmom. But also, is parenthood a requirement to be a woman or to be a candidate or to be humble? And also, as Kamala Harris now famously said, she's not aspiring to be humble, which is a whole other conversation. And then she also defended, her role in a non-traditional family, which there's more and more Americans who are part of these non-traditional family structures. And then also today, my colleague Young Jin Kong just came out with an op-ed in the Fulcrum about respect for non-traditional families. And she is a fellow professor at UIS. So really great work on this area. But yeah, it just gets back to this idea of a lot of pressure about gender and expectations around family, around labor, and basically what counts. But as you alluded to, I want to harken back to what you said a few moments ago because it was so important. Like the idea that when you talked to Harris in person, she had all this data, she had all these facts. I mean, this is a pattern that we see in the workplace and in other parts of society where women come prepared with receipts for these conversations. And sometimes their gender is the reason why they do that, but also maybe why they're not taken as seriously. And as a professor and someone in political science, but also for women that I talk to in all kinds of fields, if you go to an academic conference, a lot of times as a woman, you'll start talking about your research, and a man will say, I don't study what you do, but I think this. And it's just like immediately invalidating sort of your expertise because they somehow have come up with an answer to something that they're not an expert in because of their confidence. And so this is a really common occurrence. My PhD advisor, Samara Clar, at University of Arizona, she actually started an organization called Women Also Know Stuff, and this
Oh boy.
organization, yeah, women also know stuff. It sounds
Yes.
a little bit not grammatically correct, but I think it technically it is. But anywho, it's a great organization that helps to publicize the expertise of women in political science, but now across different disciplines. Now there's a people of color also know stuff spinoff from people in the discipline. And so it's just a simple idea, but it came from her experiences and so many of our colleagues' experiences with these kind of like conference interactions. But that's just in one field, but so many different fields deal with this. And this is certainly true on the campaign trail for candidates who are under a lot of media scrutiny, public scrutiny, etc.
Well, and I think the other thing, and that I Trump is a perfect example of this. It's the impulsivity of a male person like candidate being able to say the most insane things. If I recall correctly, Donald Trump referred to, I forget the man's name, but he referred to the man's genitalia at a
Yes,
rally
Arnold
unprompted.
Palmer.
Arnold Palmer, and yet that's considered, oh, that's Donald being Donald. But Kamala Harris little was calling out Brett Baer for misusing the incorrect clip in their interview, and she called him out for downplaying Donald Trump's fascistic tendencies, especially as he refers to the American people he disagrees with as the enemy from within. And
Mm,
not to be unnecessarily blunt, but some people use that as a pretext to say she's bitchy, and that's
mm,
unfortunately this weird and cruel restriction that are placed on women candidates, where they're expected to be like in a role that they're criticized for being quote unquote
yeah,
feminine, and yet when
right.
they break out of that, they're seen as transgressing. I guess
Absolutely.
the situation in this case, I think, requires some solutions. And to what extent have you seen some research that might be able to like challenge or change some of these standards? Because obviously this is untenable for a meritocratic democracy.
Absolutely. I think that there's some really great research from other places in the world that shows that when uh, societies reach parity in terms of political representation, that's normally because there were important structural changes to do this. Like my colleague Adriana Crocker, also in the School of Politics and International Affairs, she studies Latin America, and she'll be the first to tell you that um, countries that have split ballot types of organizations, or meaning that there's a male candidate offered next to a female candidate on the ballot, and there's actually gender quotas, those structural changes do produce change in the legislature and in places of higher government like the executive roles. And then, so that's one way to change. But also, I think that until there is a woman president in the U.S., for some folks, it won't seem possible until it is possible. I
Mm.
think this was certainly true for President Obama, but we can think about leaders like Shirley Chisholm, who had the audacity to believe that, she was presidential material. And she was very open about her status as a Black woman, but she also, valued herself. And I think at the time, people didn't totally understand. She was definitely ahead of her time in terms of issues and advocacy as well for things like working families in the 1970s. But also, I think that, she kind of proved this idea of you have to believe, and if you can't see it, then sometimes it seems like it'll never happen until it does. And so there's definitely been a lot of movement in Latin America, and the US is honestly one of the last developed countries that is yet to have a woman president. So it will happen at some point. It's just a question of whether or not it will happen in a few short weeks here, or not.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has struck me and has frustrated me is this cyclical, almost self-fulfilling prophecy. People assume the voters are more sexist than they are, or in some cases
Hmm.
they are quite sexist, and then they don't want to put forward a woman candidate in the first place, and that creates
Yeah,
this perpetual state of us not having a woman in office because we assume she can't win,
right.
and I think that's especially true on the local level. I think that's also true on the presidential level, but to how do we convince voters that not only is this a situation where how we've thought about what it means to be presidential and really deserving of public office is flawed and wrong, but also how do we
Mhm.
get them to look at it and reevaluate how we look at what it means to be a woman's in society to change as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing I wanted to point out is that in the same way that Kamala Harris is sort of avoiding talking about her race and her gender, the Trump and Vance campaign is really focused on both of those things, right? And so this is an opportunity for a broader conversation about what it means to be feminine, but also what it means to be masculine. So there was this really great survey by Pew Research. I'm like a huge Pew Research
Me too.
fangirl here. But just last week, a survey came out about masculinity and masculine norms, and it found that 60% of Americans believe that in the U.S. there's not enough support for men who are caring and show emotion. So that shows a lot of potential for this broader conversation about what it means to be a man. Meanwhile, there are some interesting gaps. For example, older men and Republican men are the most likely to describe themselves as, quote, highly masculine and are more skeptical of these ideas of toxic masculinity. But I do think that, Vance is going on these kind of like growy podcasts and stuff like that. And there's definitely a strategy there. However, I'm not sure how much of the public this actually represents. Um, and so, that being said, this is expected to be the election with the highest gender gap or largest gender gap in terms of voter choice. Potentially, well, it's yet to be seen, but this could potentially be the largest gap in voter choice between men and women voters in the US. And that's really significant. And this will most likely be across racial groups and other groups as well. So this is really fascinating. But also, I think that some women are pushing the message, especially since reproductive rights are a key part of this election. That your vote is secret, and so if you don't want to alert your family members, for example, maybe your spouse, that you're going to vote for Kamala Harris, for example, then you certainly could do that. My grandma actually told me that she heard a man talking about the same thing, basically, but instead voting for Trump. But I also think that, hiding your vote or a spouse, let's say a man and a woman voting for different candidates was very common, especially in the 50s and 60s when the parties were offering different but relatively similar types of messages.
Mm.
But now it's actually sort of less likely to even have these ideologically split marriages. And we're just so isolated in so many different ways from each other. But I do think that it's both understandable and maybe concerning, but also just really fascinating that there's this huge gender gap going on. And I think it has to do a lot more than just about who's at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, and to kind of circle back to the to that spousal relationship that you
Hmm.
mentioned, remember distinctly when I was working for the Elizabeth Warren campaign, I was phone banking, and I had to call a gentleman who was almost certainly not interested in Elizabeth Warren at all. I called him and he goes, "I don't want any of your Elizabeth Warren nonsense. You and your
Hmm.
socialist commies." Da 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 da. Hang up. Okay, fine, no problem. I go to call. I see another person on that list. It's the same number. It's his wife, and I called
Mm.
him, called the number again. He starts yelling at me again. And I said, "Sir, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to contact you, but this is the only number I have to contact your wife." And he says, "Well,
Mm.
she's not interested in that socialist stuff." Da, 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 da. And I said, "I understand that. I can't, but I need to hear that from her." She
Yeah.
says, "Who is this?" And I said, "I'm with the Elizabeth Warren campaign." Da 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 da. Start telling her, and she's like, "Liz, I love Liz." And then
Yeah.
she proceeded to end up being a commit to vote for Elizabeth Warren. So there is, I think, a really even like as far back as that, there was this strong element of almost like men trying to reinforce control over how their spouses voted.
Yeah.
And that's
Absolutely.
something that's especially disturbing. To what extent have you seen any have you seen any evidence of like attempted coercion on a larger scale outside of like the anecdote I just provided here?
I haven't necessarily seen that or heard direct evidence of that, but I think anecdotally, it's really important to think about people who might be facing coercion, like older voters, for example, people that might need help getting to the polls. And again, these disparities in labor can also lead to disparities in the ability to exercise your vote. And so women are still a little bit more likely to turn out to vote in most across most groups. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't still barriers that women are facing in voting. And so, one thing you can do is make sure you know about your state's voter intimidation line, and that way you can call and step into action if you feel like someone is being intimidated. Also, you can remind people of different strategies for still exercising their right to vote. Though, again, I do feel like we're so ideologically isolated that perhaps it might not be. I'm not. I'm just not sure how much it is the case that there are these couples, and then people are voting differently. But again, the proof is sort of in the pudding. Like when you ask people something on a survey and then they actually do it, there's always a gap because people
Yes.
lie. And so like for example, when you ask people if they're going to vote, far more people say they're going to vote than actually turn out to vote. So that's
Yes.
so it's I have no judgment on the morality of this at all. I just think that it's definitely the case that there are very likely going to be some folks that say, "Hey, honey, I'm voting for blankety blank," and that's not what happens, right?
Yeah, no, and it does kind of strike me now with this gender gap. I think I wouldn't be surprised, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would not be surprised if there was some sort of partisan realignment along gender.
Hmm.
I know a lot of the discussion has been around like class and race, and those are absolutely influential. But I think a lot of things I've noticed, particularly in my admittedly anecdotal experience in the online politics world, is a subsection of so-called like bro podcasts, like you described them
Yeah.
as that, like Andrew Tate and Fresh and Fit and a lot of other podcasts that are appealing to this. I wouldn't necessarily say traditional form of masculinity because a lot of it is based in faulty understandings of history,
Hmm.
especially like valorizing the 1950s in the cartoonish sense.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
but I wouldn't be surprised if like young men feeling like they're not getting a certain element of compassion went to people who take advantage of that. And to what extent
Yeah.
does a very poor understanding of healthy masculinity contribute to some of the ways in which we see a negative views of femininity in our election cycle? To what extent do those people contribute to that perspective?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, as someone who studies political psychology, I try to be empathetic in understanding how people got to the place that they are in their thoughts and behaviors. I will say that, like men's feelings and like white people's feelings are not more important than the safety of women and feminine people and people of color. However, that being said, people's feelings do matter in that they impact their behavior. So maybe there's a different way to reach out to young men who are feeling isolated or feeling misunderstood, and redirect some of that energy towards something else. I think that that could be incredibly important as well. And so I definitely like that idea because, again, it's pretty difficult to talk about femininity and in gender when we have conversations about quote unquote gender in politics. We assume we're talking about women, right? But we're not necessarily, right? The same way how those of us studying race and ethnicity politics, we're also understanding that whiteness is a race, and so white people need to be involved in that conversation as well. It's not possible to talk about one thing without at least implicitly invoking the quote unquote other in these situations, right?
Yeah. So, and just to wrap up a little bit, there's two hypotheticals here. Let's say in November, Vice President Harris becomes the president elect and Donald Trump is defeated. Knock on wood. Uh, let's say that happens. Do you think that some of these ideas of masculinity and really a lot of these sexist tropes will start to be weakened? Or do you think there'll be some sort of backlash to that, similar to what we saw with January 6th, but more on a more ideological, cultural level?
There's always backlash whenever there's any type of progress. And, progress depends on who you are and how you're looking at things. But certainly there was immediate backlash in terms of racist attitudes and actions during the Obama administration. And so, again, Kamala Harris would be dealing with probably misogynoir and, racist and sexist attacks. So I definitely think that would be expected should she win the presidency. However, I also think this impact of seeing to believe could be really, really important and just sort of like break that awkward, um, break this awkward lag in what's going on with America kind of deal compared to, again, other developed countries, other comparable nations. And so, again, Hillary Clinton talked a lot about the highest and hardest glass ceiling, and Kamala Harris doesn't talk about that. But that doesn't mean that it's not important, or uh, or or monumental change occurring if this were to take place. But either way, the work will never be done in terms of undermining these pervasive stereotypes or getting to a place where there's more parity throughout the political sphere and throughout the social sphere for women and feminine people. I just wanted to quickly say that, Connor, I know that you are a feminist and self identified, and it's very, very important. It's very important for women, for gender minorities, and LGBT people that we have our male feminist allies step up. That's just really important that men, especially young men, are visible and heard to bring a counter to this bro culture. I don't want a whole generation of men to be stereotyped that way. I just don't think that that's accurate. But we need to see and hear you.
Yeah, and I would also add, and I've said this to some friends who vehemently disagree with me on gender issues, and some of them I've tried to wean off of listening to Andrew Tate, and I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I think men deserve better than these bro podcasts. I think from the very
Mm-hmm.
beginning, our dignity as human beings supersedes
Yes.
any sort of supposed masculinity that can be observed in this. In these so-called intellectual leaders, I do not consider them all that intellectual.
Mm.
But to finish up, I want to thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. You're more than welcome to come on. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to give before we go?
I'm really happy with this conversation, and I think this is a very important topic. So I hope that it provided some food for thought. And again, I just hope that all of your listeners make a plan to vote and be visible and heard feminists out in the world out there.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.